there's been an announcement today that there is now a third vaccine. This third vaccine by, I think it's AstraZeneca, has shown at least up to 90% efficacy based upon one version in which they provided half a shot and then half a dosage, and then a month later a second dosage that proved to have a 90% efficacy. They still have more people to run through their trial. The advantage of that specific vaccine is that it has even less refrigeration requirements, or is less stringent refrigeration and cold requirements than first the Pfizer one and then even the Moderna one, and could be a little bit cheaper. So but one thing that people need to understand is that we heard that that Moderna was part of Operation Warp Speed, which meant that they got money for the development. Well, and despite the fact that Pfizer's out there saying that they weren't part of Operation Warp Speed, what they did get was government money ahead of time to begin to produce and distribute a potential vaccine. Here is Rob Weitzman, president of Public Citizen, on Democracy Now!, making it clear that none of these drug companies, are doing what they're doing without substantial financial support from us, our government, our society, the taxpayers. This is clip number 10.
Explain what it means to say that these vaccines should belong to the world, not be the property of a private corporation.
Well, it turns out that the investment in these vaccines, as for most drugs, has really been underwritten by the taxpayer, by the government. In the case of Pfizer, they did not take direct money from the government to finish their vaccine, but they're relying heavily on a publicly funded invention as the core of what they're trying to do. In the case of the Moderna vaccine, which really should be viewed as the National Institutes of Health Moderna vaccine, the government actually owns a portion of the vaccine, we believe. It funded 100% of the development at Moderna. And as you said, the government has pledged $1.5 billion to purchase the vaccine that we co-invented and 100% paid for. So these are vaccines that the government has a investment interest in, an ownership interest in the case of Moderna. And therefore, when we think about how it's going to be procured and distributed, and most importantly, produced and supplied in the U.S., but around the world, the government's just got to say, we're going to exercise our powers. I will say, though, even if the government hadn't paid for the vaccine, even if the inventions weren't product of public investment over many years, in light of the pandemic, we should still say we cannot tolerate patent monopolies, corporations, conferring on corporations the power to control who can make the vaccine and how it's going to be supplied. What we should do in the United States and around the world is say, this is technology that the world needs, and we're going to share it as widely as we possibly can to make sure we can produce as much vaccine as we need as quickly as possible to get not just the United States, but the entire world out of the pandemic quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that final point is even the most important one in many respects. And I know that some will say, well, there's no incentive for the next time for these companies. Give them 10% profit. Like a 7 to 10% profit. You can get that. I mean, despite the fact that we have also we should own this stuff if we have that type of investment in the first place. But even if we didn't, I think it's perfectly reasonable to, exercise some type of like defense production authority, and which is already set up as, and you get a reasonable profit, 7 to 10%. There you go. You're just not going to be able to use, because even in the context, even though despite the fact that this technology was all developed essentially by the government, everything else they have too exists because we have a society and we have a government. And so, just the fact that you can have your factory and not have to worry about, marauders of pirates coming in and cleaning you out. Sometimes society calls and says, we want it. And that's it.
It's so absurd that this is still left up to the private sector, where all of the risk is socialized and all of the reward goes as profits to the people who own this pharmaceutical company. Like, wouldn't it be nice, instead of having to summon the political will to invoke this act every single time the government needs to, whether or not they can do it depends on a lot of other factors. Wouldn't it be great if they just did this themselves because it's a thing that people need?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I think like it's so baked into Washington's consciousness and collective consciousness, basically. And I don't think the Biden administration is going to change anything about it, where they're almost like, well, we are paying and subsidizing these private corporations for the privilege of their service, what they're providing for us with this vaccine, because they have the expertise, as opposed to seeing it more as a public investment in the creation of what these private corporations only have the infrastructure for, because that's what our society has set up, right? So I don't see the Biden administration really challenging this at all and implementing what we're talking about here. I think they will say publicly, right, we want to keep prices down. The vaccine should be available for everybody. I think some are saying for free, but some are saying at a low cost.
Affordable access to the vaccine.
Exactly. Right. And they're not going to see, no, you, Pfizer, Moderna, and all the companies that benefited from government investment in Operation Warp Speed and elsewhere, you're indebted to the people. And so that's where we're going, and that's where we're starting this conversation.
Well, it's going to happen, right? I mean, look, there's a strong incentive for a government to make sure that everyone gets this for free, right? Because we want to get rid of the coronavirus. And what's ultimately going to happen is our government's going to pay a huge amount of money to develop these drugs or these vaccines. Our government's going to pay a huge amount of money to distribute them. And then our government's going to pay a huge amount of money to buy and pay for them. And so basically they have outsourced every aspect of this and paid for all of it. And
they're held hostage. They're held hostage.
We're going to be paying double.
As opposed to South Korea, where, Matt, you may have pointed this out, like in South Korea, because they were so diligent about dealing with the virus itself, they are not being held over a barrel by companies that are producing the vaccine, and they're able to actually negotiate fair prices with the money that is given to them by their citizens.
Oh, yeah. And it looks like China is also going to lap us on this. Surprise, surprise. I just saw a news story the other day that China has a vaccine that they're testing now that does not need to be stored at as cold temperatures as the ones we're working with here. So
yeah. We talk a lot about those aliens that come and pass judgment about the world and like things we messed up. And I do think this issue of like, we're afraid to do something about coronavirus because we need to make sure the capitalists get credit for it. It's the same thing in climate change too, right? Like, let's make sure we own all the intellectual property on climate change and how we're going to respond to this crisis.
The real danger is going to be is if this vaccine helps with the common cold, right? Because then you're just going to wipe out a huge section of the over-the-counter drug business.
Sudafed, you're in trouble, man.